Undercover CEO orders a meal at his diner. He stops when he hears the waitress crying in the kitchen. Breaks? You get a break when I say you get a break. Now get those orders out, or so help me. The manager, Rick, tyrannically bellowed at the terrified waitress. This was just the tip of the iceberg at Reed's Diner. Want to hear how the undercover CEO uncovered the shocking truth and brought justice to his staff? Subscribe, like this video, and listen to the entire gripping story. The first bite of the patty melt, his diner's signature, was halfway to Jacob Reed's mouth when the sound sliced through the lunchtime clamor of Reed's Diner. It wasn't the clatter of cutlery or the sizzle from the grill. Sounds as familiar and comforting to him as his own heartbeat. This was different. A muffled sob, quickly stifled, then another, sharper this time, unmistakably distressed. Jacob froze, the sandwich suspended. His gaze instinctively darted towards the swinging kitchen doors, the small, porthole window offering only a distorted glimpse of stainless steel and hurried movement within. Then came a voice, harsh and grating, a man's voice, too low to discern words clearly from across the bustling room. But the tone was unmistakable, angry, bullying. Another choked sob followed, raw and heartbroken. Jacob's appetite vanished, replaced by a cold knot in his stomach. He lowered the sandwich. Untouched, his senses suddenly hyper-alert. Every cheerful conversation around him, the clinking of coffee cups, the upbeat tempo of a classic rock song from the jukebox, it all faded into a dull background hum. The only sounds that mattered now were the ones seeping from beneath the kitchen door, painting a grim, invisible scene. Who was crying? And why was that man yelling with such vitriol? The casual atmosphere of the diner suddenly felt like a thin veneer over something ugly. A prickle of unease, sharp and unwelcome, ran down his spine. Something was very wrong. Jacob Reed, at 42, was the founder and CEO of Reed's Real American Diners, a chain of 27 establishments spread across the upper Midwest. This was a classic bootstrap story. He'd inherited a single, beloved but struggling diner in Duluth, Minnesota, from his parents, and, through relentless hard work, an almost fanatical devotion to quality comfort food, and a genuine knack for hospitality, had transformed it into a thriving regional brand. Reed's Diners were known for their perfectly crisp hash browns, their mile-high pies, and a come-as-you-are, your family here atmosphere. Jacob himself was usually found in the sleek Minneapolis corporate headquarters, a glass-and-steel building that felt miles away from the mica countertops and vinyl booths of his diners. His days were a blur of spreadsheets, marketing strategies, supply chain negotiations, and franchisee meetings. He wore tailored suits now, not the aprons of his youth, and his hands, once perpetually smelling of onions and coffee, now mostly handled pens and conference calls. Despite the corporate trappings, Jacob prided himself on still having diner grease in his veins. He believed the core of his success lay in the values his father had instilled. Treat your employees like gold, and they'll treat your customers like royalty. Reed's wasn't just a business. It was a legacy, an extension of his family. That's why, several times a year, he'd shed the CEO persona, don a baseball cap and worn jeans, and visit his locations unannounced. He'd sit at the counter, order a black coffee and a short stack, and just listen, observe, ensure the Reed's promise was being kept. Lately, though, a disquiet had begun to settle in his mind. The Minneapolis Lake Street location, one of his busiest and usually a flagship performer, had seen a dip in online customer reviews. Vague comments about surly staff and slow service had appeared. More troubling was an anonymous email that had landed in his corporate inbox a week ago. It was brief, almost desperate, alleging a toxic work environment at the Lake Street Diner. mentioning a manager named Rick who was a tyrant and alluded to impossible schedules and staff at breaking point. The email also contained a cryptic, alarming sentence. Ask about the storeroom fire last month. Wasn't an accident like they said. The fire. Jacob remembered the incident report. A minor electrical fire in a back storeroom. Quickly contained, minimal damage. Nothing to suggest foul play. But the email, combined with the declining reviews, had set off alarm bells. Had he become too disconnected? Was the family, culture he cherished eroding under his nose? He'd chosen the Lake Street Diner for his next undercover visit with a specific, uneasy purpose. To see if the heart of Reed's was still beating strong, or if something was poisoning it from within. He hadn't expected to hear evidence of that poison within minutes of walking through the door. The harsh, muffled words from the kitchen continued, punctuated by the waitress's broken sobs. Jacob couldn't make out specifics, but the aggressive cadence of the male voice and the sheer despair in the female cries painted a vivid, ugly picture. He had no more. Pushing his plate away, he rose, feigning a need to use the restroom, which would take him past the kitchen entrance. As he neared, the voices became clearer through the gap where the swinging door didn't quite meet the frame. Absolutely useless. Can't even carry a few plates without. If you can't handle the pressure, then get out. There are a dozen people who'd kill for your job, sweetheart. It was Rick, the manager, his voice a venomous hiss. I'm sorry, Rick. A young woman choked out between sobs. I only asked if I could take my break. I've been on for 10 hours, my feet. Breaks? You get a break when I say you get a break. Now get those orders out, or so help me. The threat hung in the air. Jacob's jaw tightened. He caught a glimpse through the crack. Rick, a heavy-set man with a florid face, loomed over a slender waitress with blonde hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. She was backed against a stack of bus tubs, tears streaming down her face, her shoulders shaking. This was Megan, her name tag visible even from this angle. Other kitchen staff, a young line cook, an older dishwasher, moved with frantic, jerky motions, their eyes downcast, pointedly avoiding the confrontation but radiating a palpable tension. Then, the young line cook, Connor, a kid with bright red hair and a dusting of freckles, spoke up, his voice nervous but clear. Hey, Rick, lay off her, man. She's been slammed all morning. We all have. And we're still short-staffed from that storeroom fire messing up inventory. Rick whirled on him. You want to be next, college boy? Keep your mouth shut and flip those burgers. The fire was faulty wiring. End of story. Nothing to do with inventory and nothing to do with you. His denial about the inventory felt overly aggressive, almost defensive. Jacob had heard enough. More than enough. The anonymous email wasn't just disgruntled chatter. It was an understatement. This wasn't just a tough manager. This was abuse. And Connor's comment, Rick's defensive reaction to the fire and inventory. It all felt deeply wrong. The pride he felt for Reed's Diners curdled into a sick anger. His father's voice echoed in his head. Treat your employees like gold. This was the antithesis of everything Reed's was supposed to stand for. He retreated to his table, his mind racing. His initial goal had been a general assessment. Now it was laser-focused, expose Rick, protect Megan and the other staff, and get to the bottom of that fire. He couldn't just storm in and play the outraged CEO. Not yet. He needed to understand the full scope, gather more information, and ensure that when he acted, it was decisive and just. He picked up his coffee cup, his hand trembling slightly, not from fear, but from a cold, gathering rage. The taste was bitter. Jacob forced himself to stay for another hour, observing. Rick's demeanor seesawed. When customers were within earshot, he was superficially polite, a thin veneer of professionalism. But Jacob watched him snap at a busboy for dropping a fork, hissing threats under his breath. He saw Megan emerge from the kitchen later, her eyes red and swollen, forcing a brittle smile for her tables. Connor, on the grill, worked with a silent, furious intensity, his shoulders hunched. The entire atmosphere behind the counter was one of strained silence and barely suppressed fear. Before leaving, Jacob paid his bill, leaving Megan a generous tip and a quiet, "Hang in there," which earned him a startled, grateful look. His mind was already formulating a plan. He couldn't rely solely on what he'd overheard. He needed more. Back at his hotel, he made a few discreet calls. First, to his head of corporate security, a retired police detective named Frank Mosley. "Frank, I need a quiet, deep dive into the manager of our Lake Street diner, Rick Peterson. Personnel file, financials for that branch, any red flags. And I need untampered security footage from the kitchen and back office for the last month, especially around the date of that storeroom fire." Next, he called Sarah Jensen, his VP of HR. "Sarah, I'm getting disturbing reports from Lake Street. I need you to be ready to act fast on a personnel issue there, and start thinking about interim management, just in case." The initial information began to trickle in over the next 2 days. Rick Peterson's personnel file showed a history of transferring between branches, with some vague notes about interpersonal issues, but nothing concrete enough to have previously warranted serious alarm at the corporate level. A failure Jacob now squarely placed on his own detachment. The branch financials, however, were more revealing. For the last 6 months, under Rick's management, food costs were inexplicably higher than comparable Reed's locations, despite similar sales volumes. Cash handling reports also showed minor but persistent discrepancies. Getting the security footage proved a complication. Rick, it turned out, had reported a glitch in the DVR system around the time of the fire. Footage from the critical days leading up to it was corrupted. The only available footage was from a wide-angle camera in the dining room, which showed Rick frequently entering and exiting the back office, often carrying ledgers or small bags, but nothing definitively incriminating regarding the fire itself. Frank, however, managed to recover some fragmented data from the corrupted kitchen camera. It was choppy, but it showed Rick in the storeroom area late the night before the fire was discovered, without any apparent reason to be there at that hour. It wasn't a smoking gun, but it was deeply suspicious. Jacob realized he needed to talk to Megan and Connor directly, but approaching them at the diner was too risky. He obtained their home addresses from HR, a slight abuse of his power, he acknowledged, but a necessary one. He decided to approach Connor first, remembering his flicker of bravery in the kitchen. He drove to Connor's apartment building near the university, looking every bit the concerned regular customer he pretended to be. He bumped into Connor as the young man was heading out, presumably for his shift. "Connor, right? From Reed's? I was in the other day. Name's Jake. Look, this might sound strange, but I heard what happened in the kitchen with your manager and Megan. It didn't sit right with me." Connor eyed him warily. "Yeah, well, Rick's always like that. Is there more to it?" Jacob pressed gently. "That fire, for instance." Connor hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. "Look, mister, I don't know who you are, but Rick's bad news." "And that fire?" "He was acting weird before it, and he's been even worse since. He practically lives in that back office now. If you're really concerned, maybe you should talk to Megan. She's been here longer. She's seen more." Connor gave him Megan's address, confirming what Jacob already knew, but his willingness to direct Jacob to her signaled a small crack in the wall of fear. The stakes were rising. If Rick was indeed involved in something criminal, the employees were in a potentially dangerous situation. Following Connor's implicit suggestion, Jacob found himself knocking on the door of a modest duplex in a quiet residential neighborhood. Megan opened it, her eyes widening in surprise when she saw him. She was out of her uniform, dressed in a simple t-shirt and jeans, looking younger and more vulnerable without the diner's harsh fluorescent lighting. Hi," she said, confused. "You're the guy from the diner?" "Jake," Jacob supplied, offering a small, reassuring smile. "Can I talk to you for a moment? It's important. It's about Rick and what's happening at the diner." Hesitantly, she let him in. Her small living room was neat, sparsely furnished, with a few framed photos of what looked like family on a side table. Jacob got straight to the point, explaining he was a concerned regular and that he'd overheard Rick's tirade and Connor's comments about the fire. "I'm worried about you and the other staff," he said. "What Connor said about the fire and Rick's behavior. It seems like more than just a bad boss." Megan's composure crumbled. Tears welled in her eyes. "He's a nightmare," she whispered, her voice trembling. "He changes schedules last minute, shorts our hours on our paychecks if we complain, yells constantly. We're all terrified of him. And the fire. Connor's right. Rick was weird. He'd been spending hours in the storeroom for weeks before, saying he was reorganizing. Then, after the fire, he told corporate it was old wiring, but we all saw him with cleaning supplies back there the next day, scrubbing the floor before the fire department even did their full look. And he's always in the office, messing with the deposit slips, taking cash out of the register for store supplies we never see." She confessed that small amounts of her tips had gone missing on days Rick handled the tip pooling. Jacob listened, his anger mixing with a profound sense of shame. This was happening in his company. He let these people down. He saw the fear in Megan's eyes, but also a desperate plea for help. He knew then that his undercover persona had reached its limit. He needed their trust, their full cooperation. "Megan," he said gently, "there's something I have to tell you. My name isn't Jake. It's Jacob Reed. I own Reed's Diners." Megan stared at him, her mouth falling open. Disbelief, then fear, then a flicker of something else. Hope warred in her expression. You're Mr. Reed? The Mr. Reed? Yes. And I came to Lake Street Undercover because I got an anonymous email because I was worried. What I've seen and what you've told me, it's worse than I imagined." He leaned forward. "Rick is not just a bully. I suspect he's stealing from the company, and I strongly suspect he set that fire to cover his tracks. But I need your help, and Connor's help, to prove it. I need to know everything you've seen, everything you suspect. And I promise you, you will be protected. Rick Peterson's reign at this diner is over." The revelation hung in the air. Megan was speechless for a long moment. Then she let out a shaky breath. You really mean it? I've never been more serious in my life," Jacob said. This was the point of no return. He was no longer just an observer. He was an active participant, allied with his employees against a corrupt manager. His goal had shifted. It wasn't just about fixing a problem diner. It was about justice for Megan, for Connor, for all the staff Rick had terrorized, and for the integrity of the Reed's name. He had to dismantle this toxic pocket within his company and ensure Rick faced the consequences of his actions. The revelation of Jacob's true identity initially left Megan stunned, but as the shock wore off, a palpable sense of relief, mixed with trepidation, settled in. Jacob spent another hour with her, patiently listening as she recounted numerous instances of Rick's abusive behavior, his suspicious financial dealings, and more details surrounding the fire. She recalled seeing Rick carry unmarked boxes out of the back office late at night, and his obsessive control over the daily cash deposits. Jacob's next step was to bring Connor into the loop. He arranged a meeting with both Megan and Connor at a neutral location, a quiet corner in a public library. When Jacob revealed himself to Connor, The young cook's reaction was a mixture of disbelief and dawning excitement. "So you're the big boss? Wow. I guess complaining to random customers actually works sometimes," he joked, a bit of his earlier bravado returning now that he knew he had powerful backing. Together, the three of them began to formulate a plan. Jacob emphasized that their safety was paramount. "I don't want either of you to do anything that puts you at further risk," he stated. "Rick is clearly unstable, and if he's embezzling and committed arson, he's also desperate." Jacob's corporate resources were now fully engaged, albeit covertly. Frank Mosley, his security chief, began a more focused investigation. Based on Megan's recollection of Rick messing with deposit slips, Frank cross-referenced bank records with the diner's daily sales reports that Rick submitted. He quickly found a pattern. On days with high cash sales, the deposit amounts were often slightly lower than reported, with Rick frequently signing off on cash refunds or voided transactions that lacked proper documentation. It was classic skimming, death by 1,000 cuts. The arson was harder to pin down. Without direct footage of the fire's ignition, they were relying on circumstantial evidence. Connor remembered Rick purchasing an unusual quantity of lighter fluid from a nearby hardware store a few days before the fire, claiming it was for cleaning the grill vents. Jacob had Frank try to track down that purchase, perhaps via store security footage or a credit card transaction. Meanwhile, Jacob tasked Sarah Jensen from HR with preparing a full support package for the Lake Street staff. Counseling services, assistance with filing formal complaints about Rick's abuse, and ensuring no one faced retaliation. He also had her discreetly identify potential candidates for interim and permanent management for the branch. Internally, Jacob grappled with his own culpability. How had his systems failed so spectacularly to detect Rick's behavior earlier? How had he become so removed from the daily realities of his employees? He spent sleepless nights reviewing company policies, communication channels, and oversight mechanisms, vowing that this would be a catalyst for systemic change. The most immediate complication was Rick himself, perhaps sensing a shift in the atmosphere, or simply because of the mounting pressure of his schemes, his behavior became more erratic. He was shorter-tempered than ever, and Megan reported that he'd been seen shredding large quantities of documents in the back office. The clock was ticking. They needed to act before Rick could destroy more evidence or, worse, figure out he was being watched. Jacob knew they needed one more solid piece of evidence, something irrefutable, to ensure Rick couldn't wriggle away. The investigation reached a critical juncture when Frank Mosley's team, after painstakingly reviewing weeks of transaction logs from the hardware store Connor mentioned, found it. A cash purchase by Rick Peterson for 2 large cans of industrial-grade cleaning solvent and a multi-pack of heavy-duty lighters, just 2 days before the fire. The store's security footage, though grainy, clearly showed Rick making the purchase. While not lighter fluid, the solvents were highly flammable. This, combined with the financial irregularities and the witness statements from Megan and Connor, formed a compelling case. Jacob decided it was time. He couldn't let Rick continue his reign of terror or potentially destroy more evidence. He began coordinating with the Minneapolis Police Department, presenting Frank's findings to a detective in the Economic Crimes Unit who also had experience with arson cases. The detective agreed the evidence was strong enough to bring Rick in for questioning, at the very least, and to secure a warrant to search Rick's office and home. The plan was set for a Friday afternoon, typically a busy time at the diner, which would provide some cover for the arrival of unexpected visitors. Jacob felt a knot of anxiety tighten in his chest. So much depended on this going smoothly. He worried about Megan, Connor, and the other staff, how they would react, how to ensure their safety and well-being during and after the confrontation. The day before the planned takedown, a new complication arose. A terrified Megan called Jacob. "Mr. Reed, Rick." He cornered me in the walk-in. He said he heard rumors about people talking about corporate sticking their nose in. He said if anyone was disloyal, they'd regret it. He looked unhinged. "I am scared." Jacob's blood ran cold. Rick was clearly feeling the pressure, becoming paranoid. He reassured Megan, telling her to stick close to other staff members, avoid being alone with Rick, and that everything would be resolved the next day. He secretly arranged for a plainclothes security guard from Frank's team to discreetly patronize the diner for the rest of Megan's shift and the following morning, just as an added precaution. That night was Jacob's dark night of the soul. What if Rick turned violent? What if the police intervention was messy and traumatized the staff further? Had he pushed Megan and Connor too hard? The weight of responsibility felt immense. He replayed every decision, every piece of evidence. He had to trust his team, trust Megan and Connor's courage, and trust that he was doing the right thing, not just for his business, but for the people who were its lifeblood. He steeled his resolve. Tomorrow, Rick Peterson's destructive tenure at Reed's Diner would end. He would make sure of it. The final preparations were in place. HR was ready with termination papers and support staff. Legal counsel was on standby, and Jacob himself would be there to lead the confrontation. Friday afternoon at Reed's Diner was humming with its usual controlled chaos when Jacob Reed walked in, not as Jake the regular, but as the CEO. He was flanked by Sarah Jensen from HR and Frank Mosley, his security chief, both in plain business attire. The lunchtime rush was just beginning to ebb. He calmly asked a startled hostess to fetch Rick Peterson, saying it was an urgent corporate matter. When Rick emerged from the back office, a greasy smile plastered on his face that faltered when he saw Jacob and his companions. His eyes darted around nervously. "Mr. Reed, what surprise. What can I do for you?" "Rick," Jacob said, his voice low and devoid of warmth. "We need to talk." "In your office?" "Now." Inside the cramped office, with Frank standing impassively by the door, Jacob didn't waste time. "Rick, we have substantial evidence of your gross misconduct. Abuse of staff, systematic embezzlement of company funds, and your suspected involvement in the storeroom fire on March 12th. Rick's face turned a mottled red, then pale. "What? That's outrageous. Lies. Who's been feeding you this garbage?" He tried to bluster, to deny, but Jacob cut him off, laying out a summary of the financial discrepancies, the witness statements about his abusive behavior, and the evidence of the solvent purchase. As Jacob spoke, two uniformed Minneapolis police officers, prearranged, entered the diner and were quietly directed to the office by the plainclothes security guard who had been observing. They appeared at the office doorway just as Rick was sputtering. "You can't prove anything. This is harassment." One of the officers stepped forward. "Richard Peterson, we have a warrant to search these premises and your home, and we need you to come with us to answer some questions regarding allegations of fraud and arson." Rick's bravado completely collapsed. He slumped into his chair, defeated. The officers handcuffed him and led him out, past the stunned but silent staff in the kitchen and the curious eyes of the remaining diners. Jacob then stepped out and addressed the assembled employees, his voice ringing with authority but also empathy. "Everyone, as you've just seen, Rick Peterson is no longer employed by Reed's Diner. I am Jacob Reed, the owner of this company. I know things here have been incredibly difficult. I know you've been mistreated, and for that, I am deeply sorry. That stops today." He looked directly at Megan and Connor, who stood among their colleagues, a mixture of shock and relief on their faces. "Thanks to the courage of some of your colleagues, we've been able to address this. We are committed to making Reed's Lake Street a safe, respectful, and positive place to work. We have a lot to fix, and we will do it together. A hesitant, then growing murmur of relief and hope spread through the staff. In the weeks that followed Rick Peterson's arrest, he was later charged with multiple counts of embezzlement and arson after more evidence was uncovered. Jacob Reed remained a constant presence at the Lake Street Diner. He didn't just oversee, he rolled up his sleeves. He worked shifts, bussed tables, talked extensively with every employee, listening to their stories, their fears, and their hopes for the future. Sarah Jensen from HR implemented immediate changes. Fair scheduling practices were established. A proper system for breaks was enforced, and back pay for any documented wage discrepancies under Rick was processed. Counseling services were made available to all staff. Jacob appointed a respected veteran manager from another successful branch as interim leader, with a clear mandate to foster a supportive environment. Connor, for his bravery and clear-headedness, was offered a place in Reed's management training program, which he eagerly accepted. Megan, visibly lighter and smiling more freely than Jacob had ever seen, was given a raise and promoted to shift supervisor, her natural leadership skills finally allowed to shine. She became an informal spokeswoman for the staff, ensuring their voices continued to be heard. Long-term, Jacob invested heavily in the Lake Street location. He renovated the kitchen, upgraded equipment, and instituted regular, anonymous staff feedback surveys across the entire chain. He created a new employee bill of rights for Reed's Diners, publicly committing to fair treatment, open communication, and zero tolerance for abuse. The story of the undercover CEO who cleaned house at the Lake Street Diner even got some positive local press, turning a near disaster into a testament to responsive leadership. Months later, Jacob visited the Minneapolis diner again. The atmosphere was entirely different. Laughter from the kitchen, easy camaraderie among the staff, and a genuine warmth that extended to the customers. Megan greeted him with a bright smile, and Connor, back for a visit from his training, shook his hand firmly. "It's like a different place, mister." "Reed," Megan said. "It's what Reed's is supposed to be," Jacob replied, a genuine smile on his own face. The ordeal had been a painful but necessary wake-up call. He learned that a company's heart wasn't found in its corporate headquarters, but in the daily experiences of its frontline employees. And that sometimes the only way to truly understand your business was to walk in unannounced and just listen,